Good morning, good afternoon, good night. Welcome back to another Schema Scalper video, or welcome to a Schema Scalper video if you're new. Today's video we're going to be continuing with our little education by CME group, introduction to FX. This is the last video of this series or playlist. I look at FX EFPs. Oh, if you want access to the playlist, the top right corner there should be a how can I put this? There should be a little button you can press that shows you the playlist or link to the playlist. We can watch all 6 of these videos. Let's get into it. I look at FX EFPs. I don't know what this means. So let's look at it together.
An FX EFP, or exchange for physical, involves simultaneous transactions in the cash and futures markets. An EFP is one type of ex-pit transaction that is allowed to take place outside of the central limit order book under Rule 538. Let's consider an example of an FX EFP. Assume a hedge fund is long 125 million euro US dollar FX spot in the OTC FX market and is considering booking a swap to give themselves a forward exposure he needs for his portfolio. But the hedge fund is concerned about the counterparty's credit risk going forward. One way to mitigate this risk is to utilize futures contracts that are centrally cleared and collateralized. In this case, the prospective OTC FX Euro US dollar position can easily be replicated using Euro US dollar futures. To initiate the transaction, the hedge fund contacts his broker to find another counterparty to execute an FX cash versus futures trade, EFP. Instead of executing an OTC swap, the hedge fund wants to sell his Euro US dollar FX spot position and buy an equivalent position in the Euro US dollar FX futures for a forward date. The broker confirms the agreement. The hedge fund trader writes up his side of the transaction. This consists of 2 parts: the sell of the cash side for 125 million Euro US dollar FX spot, and the buy side of the futures is 1,000 Euro US dollar FX contracts. Why 1,000 futures contracts?
Why 1,000 futures contracts? It'll be... I'm not sure.
1 euro US dollar FX futures contract has an equivalent notional value of 125,000 euros. By dividing the futures contract's notional value into the existing risk position of 125 million OTC Euro US dollars, the result is 1,000 equivalent futures contracts. The broker writes up the counterparty side of the transaction, which is buying 125 million Euro US dollar FX OTC spot and selling 1,000 Euro US dollar FX futures. Both parties report their side of the transaction to their respective clearing firms, which in turn submit each trade to the clearing house. Once the trades are submitted to the clearing house, the long futures position reside in the book of the hedge fund and the short position on the broker's customer account. The transaction is complete, and these new futures positions are just like any other open futures positions. They are subject to margining and can be offset at any time. The hedge fund now has the forward Euro US dollar position exposure it wants, and has also mitigated counterparty credit risk by using centrally cleared Euro US dollar FX futures. Let's consider another example of an FX EFP transaction. This time, let's assume there is a commodity trading advisor, also known as a CTA. CTAs manage money for their customers. The CTA sees depth and liquidity in the FX OTC market and decides to negotiate a 50 million Aussie US dollar OTC FX spot trade on behalf of his accounts under management. But instead of booking an OTC FX swap to move their exposure forward, the CTA immediately thereafter decides to convert the OTC exposure to futures. The CTA and the counterparty decide to negotiate and execute an EFP, whereby the quantity of the 50 million Aussie US dollar OTC spot originally executed would cancel out with the 50 million Aussie US dollar OTC spot for the EFP. The accounts under management would be left with Aussie US dollar futures. In this scenario, because it is an immediately offsetting FX EFP, executed by a CTA, the initiating and offsetting cash legs are not required to be passed through the customer who received the exchange contract as part of the EFRP. However, in a circumstance where the futures leg of the transaction fails to clear, the underlying accounts under management must receive the profit or loss of the offsetting cash leg. There you have it, EFPs, an efficient way for market participants to simultaneously transact in both the cash and futures markets.
Okay, so EFPs, exchange for physical, it's just an exchange between a broker and a customer, or two counterparties. So it's exchanging your physical to futures. That's what I'm looking at. Over the OTC, over the counter currency, or FX to futures. An FX exchange for physical EFP involves simultaneous transaction in the cash and futures market. EFPs are the one type of expert transaction that is allowed to take place outside of the central limit order book under Rule 538. I don't know what Rule 538 is. FX EFP trade example. Assume a hedge fund position is long 125 million euro USD FX forward in the OTC FX market. He is concerned about counterparty A's credit risk. One way to mitigate that risk is to utilize futures contracts that are centrally cleared and collateralized. So credit risk. In this case, over-the-counter FX Euro USD positions can easily be replaced using Euro USD futures. To initiate the transaction, the hedge fund contacts his broker to find another counterparty to execute an FX cash versus futures trade, EFP, exchange for physical. The hedge fund wants to sell his Euro USD FX forward position and buy an equivalent position of in Euro USD FX futures using a nearby futures contract. The broker confirms the agreement. The hedge fund trader writes up his side of the transaction. This consists of two parts: selling the one side. That makes sense. So you're selling that amount, and then you'll have a balance of, so you sell 125 Euro USD FX forwards. You have a balance of 125 million, and then you're buying futures, 1000 futures contracts to the value of the 125 million, which is 1000 because of notional value. 1 Euro USD contract has an equivalent notional value of 125,000 euros. By dividing the futures contract notional value into the existing risk position of 125 million over the counter Euro USD forward, the result is 1000 equivalent futures contracts. The broker writes up counterparty side of the transaction, which is buying 125 million Euro USD FX over the counter forwards and selling 1000 Euro USD FX futures. Both parties report their side of the transaction to the respective clearing firms, which in turn submit each trade to the clearinghouse. Once the trades are submitted to the clearinghouse, the long futures positions reside in the book of the hedge fund, and the short position on the broker's customer account. The transaction is complete, and these new future positions are just like any other open futures positions. They are subject to margining and can be offset at any time. The hedge fund now has Euro USD position exposure it wants, and has also mitigated counterparty credit risk by using central clear. Okay, so counterparty credit risk. What is counterparty credit risk? So what if counterparty credit risk? The risk arising from the possibility that the counterparty may default in the amount owed on a derivatives transaction. Okay, it's as I assumed. It's that there won't be enough Euro USD over the counter forwards, or enough people interested in filling this position. So he sells his positions to get these futures contracts, which you can offset at any time. Thus, immediately offsetting FX EFP example. This time assume that there is commodity trading advisor CTA who manage money for the customers. The CTA sees depth and liquidity in the FX OTC market and decides to negotiate a $50 million Aussie USD OTC forward on behalf of his accounts under management. Immediately thereafter, the CTA decides to convert the OTC exposure to futures. The CTA and the counterparty decide to negotiate and execute on EFP, whereby the quantity of the $50 million Australian USD OTC forwards originally executed would cancel out with the $50 million Euro USD OTC forwards of the EFP exchange for physical. The account under management will be left with Australian dollar US dollar futures. In this scenario, because of an immediate offset FX EFP and executed by the CTA, the initiating and the offsetting cash legs are not required to be passed through the customers who receive the exchange contact as part of the EFP. However, in a circumstance where the future leg of the transaction fails to clear, the underlying accounts under management must receive the profit or loss of the offsetting cash leg. So the EFP is a privately negotiated transaction between the two parties to the trade, where the consummated transaction must be reported to the exchange. So consummated, I think consummated means end transaction, consummated. Consummated, to complete, nope, to complete. Okay, so the EFP is a privately negotiated transaction between two parties to the trade, where the completed transaction must be reported to the exchange. Yes. Cool. Get a little certificate of completion. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment, and the whole playlist will be up here somewhere in the corner. Cheers, bye.